What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be talking about how Christianity cultivates nationalism and supremacy. Christianity doesn't just accidentally align with nationalism. Its theology, power structures, and moral framing repeatedly make supremacy feel divinely justified. This is not a Christians are bad video. That would be way too easy. It's a systems analysis video. Christianity doesn't create nationalism by accident. It trains people to accept hierarchy, divine favoritism, and moral exceptionalism, which nationalism then repurposes at scale. Let's start with the mechanism. Christianity is a supremacy framework before it's a national one. As we've already discussed with our Everything Wrong with the Bible series, the problem begins with chosen people theology. Chosenness is the seed. From the beginning, the biblical story is organized around divine favoritism. God chooses one people, makes a covenant with them, protects their future, and frames others as outsiders, threats, or obstacles. This isn't just spiritual encouragement, it's identity stratification. We're not just different, we're selected. Once that framework is internalized, the world is no longer neutral terrain. It's a map divided into those within divine favor and those outside it. Supremacy doesn't require cruelty at first, just special status. And once people accept the idea that God chooses sides, hierarchy stops feeling immoral and it starts feeling natural. The second part is divine mandate. Chosen status doesn't stay abstract, it moves into action. The biblical narrative repeatedly frames expansion, conquest, and domination as obedience. Land is taken because God promised it. Enemies are removed because God commanded it, and violence is reframed as fulfillment, not aggression. This is where supremacy becomes mission shaped. If God commands it, then resistance becomes rebellion, opposition becomes evil, and harm becomes righteousness. This logic doesn't disappear when the setting changes, it simply waits for a new stage. Which brings us to moral hierarchy. Christian theology doesn't just flatten humanity, it ranks it. There is God over man over woman. There is believer who is preferred over unbeliever. There are the saved who are prioritized over the unsaved, and the clean who are treated with preferential treatment over the unclean. Even when Christianity claims universal love, it still operates with tiered moral value. Everyone may be loved by God, but not everyone is trusted, listened to, or followed equally. This makes inequality feel orderly, not just unjust. Hierarchy stops being a problem to solve, it becomes a design feature to protect. Which brings us to obedience framed as virtue. Submission, Christian formation consistently teaches that trusting authority is moral, submission is holy, questioning is dangerous, and doubt is weakness. The highest virtue is not wisdom, it's obedience. This is why Jesus doesn't say, if you love me, you'd understand me. He says, if you love me, you'd obey my commands. This trains people to accept commands without scrutiny, defer conscience to authority, and to confuse compliance with goodness. Once obedience is moralized, supremacy no longer needs to justify itself, it only needs to command. And once that happens, dissent can be framed as rebelling against God. Now, this is the locking mechanism. In Christianity, disagreement is rarely neutral. It's framed as pride, stiff necked rebellion, lack of faith, and even spiritual danger. When dissent is spiritualized, power becomes untouchable. You're no longer arguing with leaders, you're arguing with God's will. And once that logic exists, it doesn't matter where the authority is. Whether it's a prophet, a pastor, a king, or even a nation, the structure is already complete. Once a people believe that God favors them, it's not a leap to believe that the nation should too. Nationalism doesn't invent supremacy, it inherits it. You see, Christian nationalism isn't Christianity misused. It isn't Christianity misapplied. It's Christianity scaled and territorialized. It's the same theology, the same hierarchy, the same obedience logic, and the same suppression of dissent. It's just applied to borders instead of congregations. That's the mechanism. But now let's talk about the template, because it always follows the same steps. Once Christianity moves from belief to power, it doesn't improvise, it follows a script. We can map it as a loop, a theological machine that reproduces supremacy wherever Christianity becomes fused with authority. Step one, God chooses us. Every supremacy project begins with divine selection. The community is not just faithful, it's favored, not just righteous, but right, not just anointed, but appointed. This does two things immediately: it creates in group identity and it establishes moral asymmetry. We are not merely people with beliefs, we are people chosen for a purpose. At this stage, no enemy is required yet, only specialness, exceptionalism. But once a group believes it's chosen, equality becomes unstable because chosenness demands contrast. This brings us to step two: our values are God's values. Now the belief system moves from identity to moral authority. This group's customs, laws, sexual ethics, gender roles, and social hierarchies are no longer cultural choices. They're now framed as eternal truths. This is the pivot point where disagreement stops being civil and starts being sinful. If our values come from God, then disagreement isn't preference, it's defiance. This step is essential because it absolves self reflection. If God agrees with us by default, we never actually have to ask if we're wrong. Which brings us now to step three. That means that our enemies are God's enemies. Now the template requires an opposition class. Enemies don't have to be violent, they just have to exist outside the chosen moral order. They are framed as threats to purity, corrupting influences, agents of chaos, and opponents of God's will. Now, once this happens, dehumanization becomes righteous. We're no longer attacking people, we're resisting evil. And that's how you get to step four. Violence is then framed as defense or even purification. Here's the critical move: violence is never called violence, it's reframed as defense of truth, protection of children, preservation of order, purification of society, or even spiritual warfare. This is how harm becomes invisible to the people committing it, even when the violence is cultural, legal, economic, and psychological. It is experienced internally as necessary, not cruelty. Supremacy doesn't feel violent to the supremacist, it feels preventative, which is how we get to step five of our loop. Power is then justified as stewardship. Now, this is the final lock. Power is no longer domination, it's responsibility. The group is not ruling over others, they are caring for them. Controlling laws becomes moral leadership. Enforcing norms becomes protecting society, and suppressing dissent becomes maintaining order. If we don't lead, chaos will win, is the gist of the idea. At this point, supremacy has fully moralized itself. It no longer sees alternatives as viable, only dangerous. This template works whether the enemy is pagans, Jews, Muslims, indigenous people, black people, communists, LGBTQ plus folk, or secular elites. Different century, same script, it's just the faces that change. The language modernizes, the theology softens its tone, but the template remains intact. Each step reinforces the next: chosen, moral authority, enemy, justified harm, entrenched power. And once power is entrenched, the cycle restarts to defend itself. That's why reform from inside is so rare. The system interprets reform as a threat. Now, the not so shocking truth of all of this is that none of this is new. Christianity has done this before. Since its inception, this is the only thing that it has done well. At this point, the question is no longer, can Christianity be misused? History has already answered that. The real question is, how often does the same structure produce the same outcome? And when you stop telling this story chronologically, something becomes impossible to ignore. Let's start with holy war supremacy. This is Christianity at its most explicit. You have the Crusades, the Inquisition, forced conversions, and God wields it as moral override. In these moments, violence is not an unfortunate side effect, it is the point. Theology doesn't just permit harm, it commands it. Once God's will is invoked, mercy becomes optional, restraint becomes disobedience, and brutality becomes faithfulness. This is the purest form of the template. Chosen people, divine mandate, enemies of God, violence framed as obedience. And here's the key insight: violence sanctified by belief doesn't feel like violence. It feels like duty. It feels like responsibility. It feels like loyalty. It feels like righteousness under pressure. But then there's also colonial supremacy. As Christianity spreads beyond Europe, the template does not disappear, it globalizes. There's the doctrine of discovery, Christianizing conquest, indigenous erasure, and slavery framing as civilizing. Christianity becomes the moral technology of empire. It doesn't just conquer land, it conquers conscience. Colonization is reframed as saving souls, or bringing light, or introducing order, or as we often hear, elevating the uncivilized. This is where supremacy becomes paternal. Christianity didn't just walk with empire, it taught empire how to sleep at night with bloody hands. Violence is no longer framed as hatred, it's presented as help. So let's talk about racial supremacy. Now the template gets domestic. There's segregation theology, pro slavery biblical arguments, there's the white Jesus imagery, which is still problematic, and the KKK existing as an explicitly Christian organization. This isn't fringe Christianity. This is institutional theology shaping social order. Scripture is cited, pulpits are involved, and the churches are full. Race hierarchy becomes cosmic hierarchy. White supremacy doesn't have to argue for itself, it just borrows God's voice. Supremacy works best when it dons the halo of holiness. When racism is framed as God's design, resistance isn't just political, it's heretical. And that's how we get to national supremacy. This is where the past starts sounding uncomfortably familiar. You end up with fascist regimes supported by Christian institutions. This is not new. You get God, family, and country as a moral triad. We saw this in Cold War Christianity versus godless communism. Here, Christianity fuses completely with national identity. God is no longer above the nation, God becomes its endorsement. National interests are moralized, borders are spiritualized, and dissent is treated as decay. When God blesses the nation becomes untouchable. At this stage, criticism isn't disagreement, it's betrayal. These are not isolated failures, they're successful executions of the same template. So now let's talk about modern Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is simply old theology in a new hoodie. We see this with biblical values being used as policy shorthand. Biblical values sounds moral, but it functions politically. It's rarely defined because it doesn't need to be. Its power comes from assumed authority, not clarity. When invoked, it does three things at once: frames one moral vision as universal, bypasses debate by appealing to God, and then treats disagreement as moral failure. This is the same move we saw earlier. Our values are God's values. It's just now translated into law. There's no scripture that needs to be cited because the authority is already implied. You hear the language of religious freedom, but it begins to sound a lot more like dominance instead of pluralism. In theory, religious freedom protects everyone. In practice, Christian nationalism treats it as the right to impose Christian norms, the right to exempt Christian beliefs from accountability, and the right to deny others full participation based on Christian beliefs. Freedom becomes asymmetrical. When religious liberty only applies to one tradition, it stops being freedom and becomes privilege with a halo. This isn't about protecting belief, it's about protecting authority. When our psychology has been so disarmed, it's easy to overlook the harm of phrases like God bless America, not realizing that what we're saying is that America is a chosen nation. This is chosen people theology with a flag wrapped around it. The narrative sounds familiar. God founded this nation, God favors this people, and God has a special destiny for this land. Once that belief settles in, critique itself becomes dangerous. If America is chosen, then its power is presumed righteous, its history is sanitized, its victims are minimized, and its critics are suspect. National identity becomes sacred identity, and sacred things don't get questioned, they get defended. And then here's the quiet shift. God is no longer above the nation, God becomes the nation's endorsement. Political documents are treated like sacred text, founders are treated like prophets. The nation's laws are framed as divinely aligned, even when they change. This allows the state to borrow moral immunity. If God signed off on it, then harm becomes necessary, inequality becomes order, and power becomes stewardship. Same logic, just new paperwork. Then dissent gets to be framed as moral decay. Now, this is the pressure valve. Disagreement is no longer a difference of opinion, a democratic function, or a moral concern. It becomes evidence of cultural rot, spiritual rebellion, and a threat to the nation. Critics aren't just wrong, they're corrupting. This reframing is essential because it keeps the supremacy template intact. If dissent is decay, then suppression is preservation. Christian nationalism isn't about loving God, it's about using God to decide who belongs and who doesn't. Now, let's talk about why this keeps working. Let's get into the psychology. Why is Christianity so effective at producing supremacy? By now, the pattern should be clear. The question isn't whether it happens, it's why it keeps working, even on good, thoughtful, well intentioned people. And the answer isn't cruelty, it's shockingly comfort, certainty over curiosity. Christianity offers something the human brain desperately craves: answers that don't require exploration. Certainty feels safe, curiosity feels destabilizing. When a belief system explains the universe, explains morality, explains suffering, and explains your identity all at once, it relieves cognitive strain. You don't have to sit with ambiguity. You don't have to say, I don't know. You don't have to revise. Supremacy thrives because certainty doesn't ask permission to dominate. It already knows it's right. And then there's obedience over conscience. Christian formation consistently teaches that trusting authority is virtuous, submission is holy, self doubt is sinful, and inner resistance is temptation. Over time, people learn to distrust their own moral instincts. Conscience becomes suspect, obedience becomes safety, and this is how harm gets outsourced. So it's I didn't make up the rules. I just follow the rules. I didn't decide this. I just followed what I was taught. Supremacy loves obedience systems because obedience removes friction, which leads us to authority over accountability. Christian supremacy structures are top down by design. There is God, then there are God's leaders, and then there are the followers of those leaders. That hierarchy creates a moral loophole. Authority answers upward, not outward. Power is justified by position, not outcome, and harm is excused as intention. When authority is sacred, accountability becomes optional. And when accountability disappears, supremacy doesn't need to defend itself, it just needs to maintain order. And then belonging over truth is that next comfort factor. Here's the part most people underestimate: belonging is stronger than evidence. I want to say that one more time, like a good preacher. Belonging is stronger than evidence. Christianity offers identity, community, meaning, and social protection. Leaving or challenging the system often means risking family, safety, livelihood, and even love. So people learn to protect belonging, even at the expense of the truth. Supremacy benefits because loyalty is rewarded, dissent is punished, and silence is safer than honesty. Truth threatens the group, and belonging preserves it. And this all preys on the fear of chaos without hierarchy. This is the emotional core. Christian supremacy narratives are built on a quiet assumption: without hierarchy, everything falls apart. Without God at the top, morality collapses, society decays, violence erupts, and meaning vanishes, fades away, disappears. So hierarchy becomes synonymous with stability. Even when that hierarchy harms people, it still feels preferable to uncertainty. Even unjust order feels safer to most than the unknown. Supremacy doesn't present itself as domination, it presents itself as the only thing holding back the chaos. Supremacy doesn't grow in cruelty, it grows in certainty. Cruelty is the outcome, certainty is the soil. And until that soil is questioned, the pattern keeps repeating with new enemies, new language, and ultimately the same results. So now let's talk about the cost, who it damages, what this does to everyone, including Christians. Supremacy always promises protection, but it delivers fracture instead. And it doesn't just harm the people it dominates, it quietly reshapes the people who carry it. Moral injury happens when people are required to act against their own sense of right and wrong and then told that it's holy. Christian supremacy often demands silence when harm is visible, justification when violence is done for good, and rationalization when policies or practices hurt real people in real time. Over time, something breaks. People learn how to explain away what they feel instead of listening to it. That disconnect doesn't disappear, it just hardens. Faith becomes exhausting, not because belief is heavy, but because conscience is constantly overridden. Now, supremacy requires distance. You can't dominate people that you fully see. So others become categories instead of neighbors, threats instead of humans, and symbols instead of stories. And I caution the secular, atheist, and humanist community to stop falling for the same fucking trap. Stop dehumanizing other people, period. If there is any good reason to dehumanize another person, then there is always an acceptable reason to dehumanize another person. Get it? Language does the work first, which is why our team at Bridge City is working on a series called Language and Labels. Be on the lookout for it. After language does the work, then policy, and then practice. Even when no physical violence occurs, humanity erodes. And here's the quiet damage. Once you train yourself not to see the humanity in them, your capacity to see it in anyone diminishes, including yourself. Supremacy simplifies the world that we share. It turns complexity into camps, faithful or the faithless, patriotic or dangerous, moral or corrupt. This reflex feels clarifying at first, but it comes at a cost, a high price. Curiosity dies, nuance disappears, and even listening becomes risky. The world shrinks to something manageable but brittle, and brittle systems break under pressure. The result is that we all end up in a place where we're suppressing our empathy. Empathy threatens supremacy because empathy destabilizes hierarchy. So people are trained, often unconsciously, to look away, minimize harm, distrust emotional responses, and even prioritize doctrine over experience. This suppression doesn't make people stronger, it makes them numb. And numbness doesn't stop at the boundary of belief, it leaks into relationships, into parenting, into community, and even into self understanding. When identity is built on being right, chosen, or superior, it becomes extremely fragile. Any challenge feels like an attack, a threat, or even betrayal. So identity must constantly be defended. This is why supremacy produces anxiety, anger, and fear, even among its beneficiaries. Peace requires humility. Supremacy can't afford it. Supremacy eventually consumes its own believers. It isolates them, hardens them, exhausts them. No one can live well while holding the world at arm's length. So here's our exit ramp before we close today's conversation. Faith in a supreme God is not neutral. Any belief system that centers a supreme authority, claims ultimate moral truth, divides reality into aligned versus opposed, and treats obedience as virtue already contains supremacist logic, even before it becomes political. Christian nationalism is not an aberration, it is the political maturation of theism. Faith in a supreme God is the problem because supremacy is baked into the concept. Not because believers are malicious, but because the structure requires ultimate hierarchy, moral asymmetry, authorized dominance, and the suppression of dissent. That's not misuse, my friends. That's scripture. That's design. Let's be honest about what the evidence actually shows. This pattern doesn't persist because people keep corrupting faith. It persists because faith in a supreme God already contains the logic of supremacy. Supreme God? A system built on a highest authority, a chosen alignment, a divine mandate, and a moral hierarchy doesn't need nationalism to become dangerous. Nationalism just gives it territory. Christian supremacy doesn't emerge when faith goes wrong, it emerges when faith goes public. When belief moves from private meaning to shared obligation, from personal comfort to social order, from inner conviction to enforced values, hierarchy stops being symbolic and starts being structural. That's why this keeps happening. Not because Christians fail to live up to their faith, but because supremacy is the natural social outcome of theism itself. Why else have a genie if it's not to control other people? Any belief system that requires a supreme being will eventually justify supremacy among human beings. Maybe not immediately and maybe not intentionally, but definitely inevitably. So, what is the core problem that we're identifying today? Christian nationalism and supremacist theism are not primarily political movements, they are long running social programs. They work because they shape identity before choice. They normalize hierarchy before reflection, embed obedience before autonomy, and replace community with belonging to power. That means reactive strategies fail by default. Protests, debates, lawsuits, and marches all assume a shared moral grammar, comparable power, and adequate internal resilience. We don't currently have those conditions at scale. So, defense first strategies exhaust people without dislodging the system. You don't defeat supremacist ideology by opposing it directly. You defeat it by interrupting the conditions that allow it to reproduce. Christian nationalism survives because it keeps people economically fragile, socially isolated, psychologically dependent, and existentially insecure. Supremacy doesn't need mass agreement, it needs mass vulnerability. To make it plain, supremacist theism functions like legacy software. It's installed early, rarely audited, reinforced socially, and updated emotionally, not logically. You can't argue someone out of software they're still running. You have to reduce the dependency, increase the agency, and then create alternative environments where different patterns can form. That requires time, trust, and repetition, not confrontation. Now, I have to make this clear and answer the question why we're not ready for defensive posture yet. Now, this is an important and honest admission. Defense requires psychological resilience, economic margin, social backing, and coordinated infrastructure. Most people emerging from supremacist systems lack all four. So, calls to fight, resist, or stand up are premature and often re traumatizing. You don't send people into battle before they've eaten, slept, healed, or trained. Right now, the work is preparatory, not combative. Supremacist ideologies thrive when people are financially precarious, one crisis away from collapse, dependent on institutions for survival, and afraid to lose belonging. Community becomes the buffer against coercion. When people have mutual aid, skill sharing, emotional safety, and collective problem solving, they are harder to scare, harder to isolate, harder to radicalize. Supremacy loses leverage when people are not desperate and afraid. Supremacist movements don't fall because they're defeated, they fall because they become irrelevant. Community does what ideology cannot. It meets material needs, builds identity without hierarchy, creates belonging without enemies, and forms ethics through relationships and not decree. This is why authoritarian systems always try to fragment communities, undermine trust, and replace mutual aid with loyalty tests. They know exactly what threatens them. And we have to make the important distinction of what kind of community. Anti only communities will always fail. Communities built around outrage, opposition, shared enemies, and constant critique burn out quickly, and recreate dominance dynamics internally. If you don't believe me, study the Black Panther movement and not just the bullet points. The community I'm describing is formative, not reactive, life building, not grievance centered, human scaled, not ideological, and developmental, not doctrinal. Its central question is not what's wrong with the world, but it's how do we help people live fully, freely, and competently. That's what produces durable change. What I'm articulating aligns with a proven historical pattern. Durable social change happens when people are organized around shared life, not shared outrage. Associational community builds trust horizontally, distributes leadership, scales organically, and acts locally while sharing global intelligence. This is why it's both cornerstone and catalyst. It stabilizes individuals and generates coordinated action when the time comes. My content aims to do something most activism content does not. It contextualizes the present, deprograms shame and fear, and restores agency over time. We are not trying to win a moment. We are trying to change the conditions that produces moments like this in the first place. That's not passive. That's strategic performance. If I had to reduce this to a single internal principle guiding this, it would be that supremacist ideologies lose power when people no longer need them to survive, belong, or matter. Community supplies what supremacy falsely promises: safety, meaning, identity, and protection, and it does so without hierarchy. That's why Bridge City exists. Need I say more? The link to connect is in the description. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, keep rising.